Imagine sending like a formal message to a foreign warlord that essentially says, um, our land is vast and wealthy, but we have absolutely no idea how to govern ourselves, so please come conquer us and bring some order.
Right, which sounds completely insane.
It sounds made up, but according to medieval monks, that is exactly how the largest nation on Earth was born. And today, we are completely tearing apart that foundational myth.
Yeah, it's a really remarkable origin story. And as you might guess, the reality behind it is, well, infinitely more complex and vastly more violent than just, a polite invitation.
Which brings us to our mission for today's deep dive. We are looking at a massive stack of sources today. We've got historical encyclopedias, the medieval primary chronicle, and some really brilliant modern academic papers on medieval political theory.
Oh, yeah, the Jeffrey L. Neal paper is fascinating.
It really is. And our goal today boils down to this single, really ambitious phrase, which is «Ektise aplotida jepeli fasitu osikoskatus», meaning to explain simply the formation of the Russian state. And I promise you, this isn't just a boring list of dates. We are going on a wild 800-year journey of Viking river traders, Byzantine princesses, Mongol warlords, and the birth of a massive autocracy.
Exactly. And to really do that, we have to kind of discard the idea of borders being drawn neatly on a map.
Yeah.
The formation of this state is essentially the story of a smelting forge. You have this massive, geographically vulnerable expanse of land. And over the course of 8 centuries, it gets pounded by these external hammers, right?
Scandinavian trade empires, Byzantine religion, Mongol invasions.
Right, Western European armies. And instead of shattering, the state absorbs the heat of those impacts to forge an increasingly hardened, hyper-centralized autocracy.
So if you're listening to this and you've ever found yourself looking at the sheer scale of Eastern Europe and wondering, how did a scattered network of tribal settlements consolidate into a transcontinental empire? Well, this deep dive is your blueprint. So let's start right at the beginning, in the 9th century, with that bizarre invitation I mentioned.
Right, so the document you're referring to is the 12th century primary chronicle. It basically presents a narrative where the local Slavic and Finnic tribes are just engulfed in chaotic infighting.
It's just total chaos.
Yeah, totally. And to resolve this, they supposedly send emissaries across the Baltic Sea to the Varangians, which are the Norsemen or Vikings. A chieftain named Rurik answers the call, establishes himself in Novgorod, and shortly after, his successor, Prince Oleg, moves south along the river networks to capture Kiev. And that's in 882.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second because I have to push back on the framing of this chronicle.
Sure.
Human nature kind of dictates that people don't just politely mail out invitations for foreign subjugation. I mean, it reads like a highly convenient piece of state propaganda written way after the fact to justify, a Scandinavian conquest of local tribes.
Well, the sources actually indicate you are touching on one of the most intensely debated issues in the region's historiography.
Yeah.
It's known as the Normanist versus anti-Normanist controversy.
Yeah.
And I should note, our role here is to strictly impartially report how our sources navigate this, because the debate itself has been incredibly politicized over the years.
How does that political divide actually break down in the sources?
So the Normanist perspective emphasizes that the state of Kievan Rus' was primarily organized and founded by these Scandinavian outsiders. Now, historically, that framework was tragically weaponized by figures like Adolf Hitler to push this horrific racial ideology that Slavs were somehow incapable of state building without Germanic intervention.
Wow, okay. And the other side?
On the other side, the anti-Normanist view, which is championed heavily by Russian and Soviet scholars, argues that the state emerged almost entirely from indigenous Slavic political evolution. So it really minimizes any external Scandinavian influence.
But looking strictly at the archaeological and textual evidence in our stack, neither of those extremes really seems to capture the actual mechanics of what happened, right?
Right, exactly. The academic consensus points to a much more messy, organic synthesis. We are looking at a highly complex, multi-ethnic frontier. You have these Scandinavian elites, highly militarized warrior merchants, who basically established themselves along the massive river systems.
Because they wanted to control the lucrative trade routes connecting the Baltic and the Black Seas.
Exactly. So they didn't arrive via a polite invitation, but they also didn't just impose a foreign top-down state. They very quickly assimilated into the vast demographic ocean of the existing Slavic culture.
And you see that ambiguity reflected perfectly in the etymology of the word Russes itself.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite details. The origin of the name is this historical mystery with 3 main theories in our sources.
Right.
It might stem from a Finnish word for Swedes, meaning rowers, which obviously aligns with the Viking river navigation.
Makes sense.
Alternatively, it could derive from the Iranian word Roxolani, meaning light,
Yeah.
or it might simply be linked to the local Ros River in Ukraine.
So the initial foundation is this sprawling multi-ethnic trade network spanning thousands of miles. But, controlling rivers and collecting furs isn't really enough to sustain an empire long term.
No, not at all.
If you want to bind a desperate population together across that kind of distance, military force eventually hits a wall. You need ideological glue. You need a shared worldview.
Which is the exact problem a late 10th century ruler named Vladimir the Great attempted to solve. He really understood the necessity of a unifying state ideology. His first attempt, though, was to construct a unified pagan pantheon in Kiev.
Right, he built those huge wooden idols, right?
Yeah, he erected massive wooden idols of various Norse, Slavic, and Finnic deities on a hill, hoping to create this centralized spiritual hub.
Like a kind of administrative consolidation of the old gods. But it didn't work. I mean, it wasn't sophisticated enough to compete with the monotheistic superpowers surrounding them.
Exactly. It failed to provide the international legitimacy he required. So according to the Chronicle, Vladimir then sends emissaries abroad to literally shop around for a new monotheistic faith.
It's basically a geopolitical version of speed dating.
Yeah, that's actually a great way to put it.
The famous story is that he rejected Islam because it forbade alcohol, supposedly declaring that drinking is the joy of the Russes.
Right.
He examined Judaism but passed on it, and he found Western Christianity's ceremonies just kind of dull. But when his envoys reach Constantinople and step inside the Hagia Sophia, they report back that they didn't know whether they were in heaven or on earth.
Right, and what's fascinating here is the aesthetic awe was certainly a factor. But if we look at the underlying mechanics of statecraft, the choice of Eastern Orthodox Christianity was driven by hard geopolitics.
Always comes back to politics.
Oh, absolutely. At that exact moment, the Byzantine Emperor, Basil II, was fighting for his life against a massive internal military rebellion. He desperately needed elite troops to survive.
And Vladimir happened to command thousands of battle-hardened Varangian mercenaries.
Exactly. So they strike a bargain. Vladimir provides the military muscle to save the Byzantine emperor, and in return, Vladimir demands to bury the emperor's sister, Anna Porphyrogenita.
I mean, it is difficult to overstate what a monumental diplomatic victory that was.
Oh, it was unprecedented. For a monarch viewed by Constantinople as a, northern barbarian to marry into the most prestigious imperial dynasty in the Christian world, it was huge. But the non-negotiable condition for the marriage was Vladimir's conversion.
Right.
So in 988, he is baptized in the Crimean city of Chersonesus, and he systematically enforces the mass baptism of the Kievan population.
It functions as a complete software upgrade for the state. Almost overnight, Kievan Russes imports Greek philosophy, monumental stone architecture, and the Cyrillic alphabet.
But there's a crucial detail here that our sources highlight. The liturgy was translated into Old Church Slavonic.
Ah, right.
They didn't adopt Greek or Latin as the language of the church, which meant they absorbed Byzantine culture, but remained linguistically insulated from the rest of Europe.
So they get the culture, but that linguistic insulation forged a fiercely distinct, self-contained religious identity. But despite this spiritual unity, the political system of Kievan Rus' was an absolute mess.
It was a disaster waiting to happen. The system they utilized is known as the rota system. Unlike systems where a kingdom passes smoothly from a father to his eldest son, political power in Kievan Rus is passed collaterally.
Right, from brother to brother.
Exactly, brother to brother, and then eventually down to the eldest nephew.
So instead of a clear vertical line of inheritance, you have a horizontal scramble. The princes were constantly rotating between different cities based on their shifting seniority within the dynasty.
Which is wild if you think about it. If one senior uncle dies, every other prince in the realm suddenly expects to be promoted to a better, wealthier city.
The mechanism inherently guarantees instability. It incentivized endless rivalries, assassinations, and just catastrophic civil wars. By the early 13th century, Kievan Rus had completely shattered into dozens of feuding principalities.
They were totally divided, which leaves the door wide open for the most devastating external shock yet. Around 1240, the Mongol Empire sweeps through.
Yeah.
They annihilate the fractured Russian armies, burn the major cities to the ground, and impose what history calls the Tatar yoke.
The devastation was apocalyptic. But normally, a devastating invasion destroys a state's evolution. How did the Mongol conquest actually lay the groundwork for the modern Russian state? Because the sources say it actually did.
Yeah, it's a huge paradox. To explain how that works, we look at the research of Jeffrey L. Neal, which is included in our stack today. Neal identifies what he calls an ideology of silence in the medieval chronicles.
An ideology of silence.
Okay.
Yeah.
The monks writing the histories naturally frame the Mongols as a divine punishment, right? A purely destructive force. But Neal's analysis reveals that the princes of a minor, heavily forested outpost called Moscow took a very different approach.
They didn't fight back.
No, they didn't resist the Mongols at all. They made themselves indispensable to them.
Wait, so they essentially observed the Mongols, realized they couldn't beat them, and decided to just become the central tax collectors for the Golden Horde.
That was exactly the mechanism. The Muscovite princes volunteered to gather the heavy Mongol tribute from all the other Russian cities, and they systematically skimmed a portion of that immense wealth to enrich Moscow.
Wow.
Furthermore, whenever a rival Russian principality challenged Moscow's authority, the Muscovite princes would simply call in the Mongol cavalry to crush their local opposition.
Oh my God. So they weaponized the occupying army to eliminate their own domestic rivals. That is incredibly ruthless.
Very. But it wasn't just about hoarding silver or using Mongol troops. The Mongols actually provided a conceptual masterclass in how to wield absolute power.
Okay, explain that.
We can trace this conceptual shift by comparing the testaments, or wills, of the Muscovite leaders. Let's look at 1339. The Grand Prince of Moscow, Ivan Khalida, writes his will using the old fragmented Kievan mindset. He takes his territory and his tax revenues and divides them equally among his sons.
Treating political sovereignty like a piece of divisible family property.
Exactly.
Which just perpetuates the same vulnerability. I mean, if you divide the realm, you divide the strength.
Right. But observe what happens after another century and a half of operating under the shadow of the Mongol Khan, who wields absolute, undivided, unquestioned authority.
Okay.
By 1503, Grand Prince Ivan III writes his will. He abandons the old tradition entirely. He leaves 87 cities and the exclusive rights of sovereignty, so the sole authority to coin money, the sole right to execute justice to one person, his eldest son, Vasily.
Wow. So the Muscovite princes learned that shared power on the open steppe is a fatal weakness.
Yep.
The only way to survive and eventually dominate is through total vertical autocracy.
Exactly. And armed with this new autocratic blueprint, Moscow begins to aggressively solve its geographic vulnerability. Ivan III, who's known as Ivan the Great, initiates this relentless campaign referred to as the Gathering of the Russian Lands. He systematically devours the independent duchies around him, bringing them under Moscow's direct centralized control.
And the most revealing example of this strategy is his absolute destruction of the Novgorod Republic.
Oh, yeah.
Novgorod wasn't just another principality. It represented a completely different trajectory for what Russia could have been. It was a massive, wealthy trading republic in the north, deeply connected to the Hanseatic League,
Which gave it an independent economic engine tied to Western Europe.
Crucially, Novgorod was governed by a merchant oligarchy and a popular democratic assembly known as the Vesh. They literally elected their own administrative officials.
Right, and Ivan III couldn't tolerate a competing political model, especially a democratic one with Western economic ties. So he launches a military campaign, crushes Novgorod, and annexes just an astonishing amount of territory.
But he doesn't just conquer the land, right? He basically dismantles the entire society.
Completely. He forcibly deports the oldest, wealthiest merchant families to Moscow to break their local power base. And then he physically rips down the great bell that they used to call the Vesh Assembly and drags it back to Moscow as a trophy.
Literally dragging a massive bell hundreds of miles just to make a point.
Yeah, it was the deliberate eradication of any alternative to Muscovite autocracy. And having consolidated this massive power block, Ivan III feels confident enough to finally sever ties with the Golden Horde. In 1480, he formally refuses to pay the tribute, which effectively ends the Mongol yoke.
So what does this all mean? Ivan III isn't just expanding his borders. He is constructing a massive ideological justification for his absolute power. And this takes us back to Constantinople, the dazzling capital of the Byzantine Empire.
Right.
In 1453, Constantinople finally falls to the Ottoman Turks. The great Orthodox Empire is just gone.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the fall of Constantinople creates an immense ideological vacuum in the Orthodox Christian world. Ivan III capitalizes on this by marrying Sophia Paleologina, who is the niece of the very last Byzantine emperor.
So he is physically importing the imperial bloodline to Moscow.
Yes, and with it, the imperial symbolism. Moscow adopts the Byzantine double-headed eagle as its state seal. But more importantly, Russian Orthodox clerics began to articulate a new world historical doctrine.
The Third Rome Doctrine.
Exactly. The framework is simple but powerful. The First Rome fell due to heresy. The Second Rome, Constantinople, fell to the Turks as a punishment from God. Therefore, Moscow is the Third Rome, and there will be no fourth.
That is just, it completely rewires the psychology of the state. The ruler in Moscow is no longer just a clever prince who manipulated Mongol tax codes.
No.
He is elevated to a divine status. He's the sole remaining defender of the true Christian faith on earth. Political autocracy and religious destiny are now completely fused.
Totally. And Ivan III laid the foundation, and he occasionally experimented with the title Tsar, which is the Russian derivation of Caesar. But it is his grandson, Ivan I, Ivan the Terrible, who really takes this theological concept of autocracy and builds the terrifying bureaucratic machinery required to actually enforce it.
Here's where it gets really interesting and honestly super dark. In 1547, a 16-year-old Ivan I formally crowns himself Tsar of all Russia. It's no longer just an informal moniker, it is an official declaration of imperial status. But Ivan I faces a practical problem. He holds the title of Caesar, but the old aristocratic families, the boyars, they still hold vast amounts of inherited land and political influence.
Right, and to solve the problem of the boyars, Ivan creates an institution called the Oprichnina.
Okay.
The mechanism here is vital to understand. The Oprichnina wasn't just a campaign of random violence. Ivan essentially carved out a massive separate jurisdiction within the state that was his own personal property. It was entirely outside the bounds of traditional law.
And he policed this territory with a private army of enforcers called the Oprichniki. And the sources describe them riding black horses, dressed entirely in black, carrying symbols of a dog's head and a broom.
Which is terrifying.
Literally to sniff out treason and sweep it away.
Yeah, the purpose of these enforcers was to systematically bypass the old nobility. Ivan used them to confiscate the ancestral lands of the boyars, often just executing entire families in the process. He then redistributed that land to a new class of men whose wealth, status, and survival depended exclusively on their absolute loyalty to the Tsar.
Not on their ancient bloodlines.
Exactly. He was engineering a new elite class from scratch. But the centralization didn't stop with the nobles. To fund this massive military bureaucratic state, Ivan IV issued a new legal code, the Sudebnik.
Right.
This code severely restricted the ability of the peasantry to move from one landlord to another.
It was the crucial legal mechanism that laid the groundwork for serfdom.
Precisely. By tying the rural population permanently to the land, the state ensured a stable, immobile tax base, and they secured a reliable source of agricultural labor to support the Tsar's endless military campaigns.
So autocracy was now codified into the very soil, subjugating everyone from the highest aristocrat to the lowest farmer. But, a system built entirely on the terror and will of one man is inherently brittle. When Ivan V dies and his dynastic line eventually fails, the entire apparatus just collapses inward.
Yeah, it completely implodes. The subsequent period is known as the Time of Troubles. Without the terrifying gravity of the Tsar at the center, the Russian state completely fractured. The country suffered catastrophic famines, widespread peasant uprisings, and devastating civil wars.
The weakness literally invited foreign intervention, culminating in Polish armies physically occupying Moscow itself.
It really looked as though the smelting forge had finally shattered. But the reflex for autocracy was deeply ingrained as really the only known survival mechanism. So in 1613, an assembly of nobles, the Zemsky Sober, convenes and elects a 16-year-old named Michael Romanov as the new Tsar.
Starting a dynasty that will rule for 300 years.
Exactly. The Romanov dynasty stabilized the state and began slowly pushing back the borders. But the final monumental phase of this state-building process doesn't really occur until the end of the 17th century, with the arrival of Peter the Great.
Peter looks at the sheer mass of Russia and recognizes a critical vulnerability. Despite its immense size, the state is technologically, culturally, and militarily lagging way behind Western Europe.
Right.
So his solution isn't just a basic modernization program, it is a brutal campaign of cultural subjugation to forge a modern empire.
And to execute this, Peter first had to break the remaining traditional power structures. Consider the Streltsy.
Okay, who were they?
These were the traditional, privileged musketeer regiments of Moscow. They wielded significant political power and had frequently rebelled. Peter ruthlessly crushed them, executing thousands and literally hanging their bodies outside the city walls.
Wow.
He then replaced them with a professional, Western-drilled standing army equipped with modern flintlock muskets and artillery.
But the subjugation went far beyond just the military. He famously implemented a beard
Oh,
tax,
yeah, the beard tax.
forcing the Russian nobility to shave their traditional long beards and adopt Western European clothing. This wasn't about fashion at all. It was a psychological mechanism to break their ties to the old Muscovite culture and force their complete submission to his new Western-oriented vision.
He even abandons Moscow entirely. He commands the construction of a new capital, St. Petersburg, built completely from scratch on a swamp facing the Baltic Sea.
It's just a massive undertaking.
Oh, huge. He was physically forcing the entire bureaucratic weight of the state to face west.
And he builds a Baltic fleet from nothing and uses this entirely retooled military machine to confront the Swedish Empire in the Great Northern War. At the Battle of Poltava in 1709, Peter's modernized army decisively crushes the Swedes.
Which permanently secures Russia's access to the Baltic Sea and fundamentally alters the balance of power in Europe.
And to codify this new geopolitical reality, in 1721, Peter officially changes the state's designation. It is no longer the Tsardom of Russia. It formally becomes the Russian Empire.
It is an absolutely staggering transformation when you step back and look at it.
It really is. I mean, we started with those Varangian warrior merchants navigating river routes in the 9th century. We watched Vladimir the Great leverage a Byzantine rebellion to secure Eastern Orthodoxy, giving the state its spiritual architecture.
We analyzed how the devastating shock of the Mongol invasion provided the Muscovite princes with an administrative masterclass, right? Teaching them to completely abandon shared governance in favor of absolute centralized authority.
We saw Ivan III use that exact blueprint to devour competing systems like Novgorod while cloaking his power in the divine destiny of the Third Rome.
And finally, through the bureaucratic terror of Ivan the Terrible and the ruthless modernization of Peter the Great, that autocratic core was forged into a transcontinental empire.
It's an incredible timeline.
It is, and when you look back at the mechanics of this evolution, it leaves you with a really compelling question based on the sources.
Okay, let's hear it.
Throughout this deep dive, we've seen the state evolve by absorbing massive external shocks, right? Scandinavian trade networks, Byzantine religion, Mongol administrative terror, and Western European military tactics. It begs the question for you to ponder. Is the true defining characteristic of the Russian state its own indigenous culture? Or is it its unparalleled historical ability to assimilate the weapons and ideas of its conquerors to make itself constantly stronger?
Man, it brings us right back to that smelting forge metaphor. The external hammers never actually broke the metal. They only managed to fold the impurities out of it, forging an instrument designed entirely for survival and expansion on a huge, undefended plain.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the maps, keep digging into the history, and we'll see you next time.